There is a man in the Gospels who has never bowed to anyone in his life. He is a soldier, Roman-trained, Roman-paid, Roman in the marrow of his bones. He has served under commanders who serve under generals who serve under Caesar, and Caesar does not kneel. Caesar is the one knelt to. Every morning this soldier has watched the ritual, the prostration before the imperial standard, lips nearly to the earth, the body saying what the empire required the body to say. You hold my life. You hold everything. This soldier has done it thousands of times. It is not spiritual to him. It is just the price of living inside Roman power. And then one afternoon, this man, this Roman, this career military man who bows to no one except the empire, walks toward Jesus of Nazareth and falls to the ground. We are going to come back to that moment, because what happens next, and the word the gospel writer chooses to describe what he does, will change how you understand almost everything about what worship actually is. Here is a question that almost no one asks in church. When the New Testament uses the word in quote, worship and quote, when Jesus himself uses it, when the disciples use it, when the book of Revelation uses it, what word are they actually using? What is the Greek behind the English translation? Because the English word in quote, worship and quote, tells you almost nothing. It has become, in most churches, nearly synonymous with a specific thing, a band, a stage, lyrics on a screen, a feeling that rises with the bass and the lights. Ask most people what worship is, and they will describe a song. Ask them when worship happens, and they will describe a Sunday morning. But the Greek word the New Testament uses for worship has nothing to do with music. Nothing. The word is proskuneo. And once you understand what it meant in the ancient world, what the body did, what the gesture communicated, what it cost, you will never use the word in quote, worship and quote, the same way again. Proskuneo. Say it slowly, proskuneo. It is built from two Greek roots. Pros means in quote, toward, and quote. Kineo means in quote, to kiss, and quote, literally, to kiss toward something. To move your face in the direction of something and bring your lips close to it. But in practice, proskuneo was not a polite kiss on the cheek. In the ancient world, it described one specific act, falling to the ground before a king or a god, bowing your head so low that your lips nearly touched the earth, and in so doing, communicating something that no speech could communicate more clearly. You hold my life. You have power over me that I cannot resist. I am here on your terms, not mine. This was the gesture of the Persian court, and it shocked the ancient world when people first saw it. The Greek historian Xenophon, writing in the 5th century before Christ, described the Persian custom at length in his work The Cyropaedia. When a subject approached the Persian king, he did not walk toward him and bow his head slightly. He fell. The body went down. The forehead approached the earth. It was called proskunesis, and it was the physical vocabulary of absolute power, the body saying what words alone could not say. Your life and death are in your hands, not mine. The Greeks found it revolting. To Greek culture, proskunesis was a slave and apos, gesture. A free man did not bow to the ground. A free man stood upright before another man and spoke as an equal, or at least as a peer with dignity. To fall on the ground before someone was to announce publicly that you were beneath them, not just politically, but as a human being. Greek soldiers who refused to prostrate before the Persian king were not being rude. They were insisting on their humanity. And this is the word, this loaded, physical, politically charged word, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the writer of Revelation choose every single time they want to describe what happens when a person truly encounters Jesus. Not a generic word for respect, not a polite religious term. Proskuneo, the word that meant, I have fallen down because there is no other appropriate response to who you are. Here in Apos, that's what most people miss. The word was not primarily about feeling. It was about posture. The ancient world did not separate the interior life from the exterior act the way modern culture does. If you proskuneo before someone, you were not being asked to feel a certain way about them first and then express it. The act itself, the body going down, the head bowed, the knees on the earth, was the worship. The physical posture was the theological statement. That is the world the Gospels were written into. That is the word the Gospel writers chose. And it should make you stop and ask, if that is worship, if that is the word on the page, then what have most of us been doing on Sunday mornings? The Jews understood proskuneo the way the Greeks did, as a transfer of ultimate allegiance, which is why it put them in constant, dangerous conflict with Rome. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the 1st century after Christ, documented a moment that nearly triggered a massacre. The Roman governor Pontius Pilate, the same Pilate who would later stand before Jesus, decided to bring Roman military standards into Jerusalem. The standards bore the image of Caesar. To a Roman soldier, they were just flags. To a Jew, they were objects before which proskuneo would eventually be required. The Jewish population descended on Caesarea where Pilate was staying and surrounded his residence for 5 days. When Pilate finally appeared before them with soldiers ready to execute anyone who resisted, the Jews did something that stunned him. They fell on the ground and bared their necks. They would rather die than proskuneo before Caesar and Apos' image. They would rather the sword than the bow. Pilate backed down. He removed the standards. This is the world Jesus was born into. A world where proskuneo was not a church word. It was a political word, a power word, a life and death word. When a Jew proskuneo before someone, they were not just being reverent. They were declaring whose they were, which makes what happens in Matthew chapter 2 so extraordinary. There are men traveling from the east. The text calls them Magoi, wise men, astrologers, scholars of the Persian tradition. They are not Jews. They have no covenant relationship with the God of Abraham. They have spent years, possibly 2 years, since Herod later orders the death of children up to 2 years old, following a star they have calculated to indicate the birth of a king. And when they arrive, they have one stated purpose. We have come to proskuneo him. Those are their words in the Greek. Not in quote, pay our respects, end quote. Not in quote, bring gifts, end quote. Not in quote, see the child, end quote. To proskuneo him. To fall before him. To make the gesture that transferred allegiance. These men have traveled perhaps 1,000 miles. They have left their homes, their practices, their countries. And when they find a toddler in a house in Bethlehem, they fall on their faces. Think about what you are watching. These are men of learning and status, the kind of men who stood upright before kings and advised emperors. And they go to the ground before a small child in a working-class home in a town so small that the prophet Micah called it least among the rulers of Judah. But it gets stranger. They were not the first ones to do it. Go back to Luke and Apos' account of the shepherds on the night of the birth. Go back to the moment the angel chorus appears to them in the fields. The shepherds are described as afraid, and the word Luke uses is phobos megas, great fear, the same phrase used when people encounter the divine throughout the Old Testament. Their bodies reacted before their minds caught up. They ran to Bethlehem. They found the child. And the encounter changed them so completely that they left glorifying and praising God. The Greek word there is doxazo, to give weight and honor to declare the worth of something. The shepherds did not sing a rehearsed song. They had no instruments, no lyrics, no stage. They had an encounter with God in a feed trough in a barn, and their entire being oriented itself toward heaven. That is proskuneo in motion. That is what the word describes. Now look at what proskuneo is not describing in the New Testament. It is not describing a feeling that comes and goes. The Magi did not travel 2 years because they felt a pleasant emotional warmth. The shepherds did not run through dark fields because a song moved them. These are acts of orientation. The entire life pointing towards something, the body following the soul surrendered to something it recognizes as ultimate. The Hebrew word that proskuneo translates in the Septuagint is shacha, to bow down, to prostrate. It appears at the burning bush when Moses falls on his face. It appears when Abraham sees the 3 visitors and runs to meet them, bowing to the ground. It appears in Isaiah chapter 6 when the prophet sees the Lord high and lifted up and says, "Woe is me, for I am undone." Not, what a beautiful moment. Undone. Dismantled. The self in the presence of ultimate holiness. That is the tradition the New Testament word is standing in. That is the emotional register of proskuneo. Not pleasantly uplifted. Not spiritually refreshed. Undone. And then, slowly, made new. Pay attention to this. Because there is a pattern building across the Gospels. Every time someone proskuneo before Jesus in the New Testament, something has already happened to them. Not inside a building, not during a scheduled service. Out in the street, in a field, on a hillside, in a boat, in a moment of crisis or wonder or grief. The setting is never the sanctuary. The setting is always life. Matthew chapter 8, verse 2. Jesus has just finished the Sermon on the Mount. He comes down from the hillside and a crowd follows him. And a man steps forward from the crowd, or rather, a man steps away from the crowd, because this man cannot be in crowds. He cannot be in the synagogue. He cannot be in the marketplace or at the city gate or near anyone he loves. He has leprosy. In the ancient world, leprosy was not simply a physical disease. It was a social death. The law required lepers to call out and quote, "Unclean, unclean," and quote, when anyone approached. They lived outside the city walls. They were cut off from the temple, from the community of faith, from everything that made a person feel like they belonged to God and to each other. This man has not been to synagogue in years. He has not sung a hymn in years. He has not sat in a service or heard a reading or experienced what most people in his community would have called worship. But he knows what proskuneo means. He walks toward Jesus, and before he says a single word, before he makes a request, before he explains his situation, before he asks for anything, he falls on his face. The Greek is proskuneo. He falls and kisses the ground before Jesus. Then he speaks, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Not, "Lord, I have done everything right." Not, "Lord, I have earned this." Not, "Lord, I have attended faithfully." Just, "if you are willing." Total surrender before a single word of response. The posture came before the prayer. The bow came before the ask. The proskuneo was not the result of receiving something from Jesus. It was the starting position. Jesus reaches out and touches him, which itself was a violation of purity law, skin on leprous skin, and says, "I am willing. Be clean." And he was. Now watch what happens in Matthew 14. The disciples are in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. A storm has come up, the kind of storm that terrifies fishermen who have spent their entire lives on that water. Jesus has not yet arrived. He is on the shore, praying. And then they see him, walking across the water toward them in the middle of the night. Peter does what Peter always does. He gets out of the boat. He walks toward Jesus. The wind hits him. He sinks. Jesus pulls him up. And then they get in the boat. And the storm stops. Immediately, the Greek is eutheos, at once, without transition. One moment the wind is tearing at the sail. The next, silence. And the disciples, these men who have traveled with Jesus, who have seen miracles, who have heard his teaching, the disciples proskuneo before him in the boat. Those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Not in the temple, not on a Sabbath, not during a scheduled service or a feast day. In a fishing boat, soaking wet, hearts still hammering from the storm. The proskuneo happened in the middle of the chaos of ordinary life, and it produced a theological declaration: "You are the Son of God." This is the pattern building across the Gospel of Matthew. No one proskuneo before Jesus because a song moved them. No one waits for the right atmosphere, the right setting, the right chord progression. The proskuneo happens when a person comes face to face with who Jesus actually is, and their body has the only appropriate response before their theology catches up. Here in apos, that's the part nobody tells you. The Greek word proskuneo appears in the New Testament in contexts of true worship and in contexts of false worship. The same word, the same gesture, different object. In Matthew 4, during the temptation in the wilderness, Satan shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and says, "All of these I will give you, if you will fall down and proskuneo me." The word is the same. The gesture is the same. What changes is the object, and the object changes everything. This is why the angel in Revelation 22 reacts so sharply when John falls to proskuneo before him. John, exhausted, overwhelmed, barely standing after the visions he has seen, instinctively falls at the angel and apos' feet. And the angel says, and the Greek is emphatic, "Do not do this. I am a fellow servant." Proskuneo God. The gesture is neutral. It is the direction it points that determines whether it is worship or idolatry. And this is the question that makes proskuneo so personal, so uncomfortable, so impossible to reduce to a Sunday morning activity. What is your life actually bowing to? There is one conversation in the Gospels where Jesus himself defines proskuneo. It happens not in a synagogue, not with the Pharisees, not with the disciples. It happens at a well in Samaria, in the middle of the day, with a woman who has been married 5 times and is currently living with a man who is not her husband. She comes to draw water at noon, which is significant. Women drew water in the morning, in the cool of the day, in groups. Noon meant she was coming alone, coming when no one else was there. The social math is not subtle. Jesus is sitting at the well, resting from the journey. He asks her for a drink. She is startled, because Jews did not speak to Samaritans, and men did not initiate conversations with women they did not know, and she says so. What follows is the longest recorded one-on-one conversation Jesus has in any of the 4 Gospels. He tells her about living water. She misunderstands, thinking he means something she can collect in a jar. He tells her to go call her husband. She says she has no husband. He says she is right. She has had 5, and the man she is with now is not her husband. She pivots to theology, the way people often do when the personal becomes too close. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say that Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. It is a deflection, but Jesus takes it seriously, because the question behind the deflection is real. And here is where proskuneo appears 6 times in 5 verses, more concentrated than almost anywhere else in the New Testament. Jesus says, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you proskuneo the Father. You proskuneo what you do not know. We proskuneo what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshippers will proskuneo the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such people to proskuneo him. God is spirit, and those who proskuneo him must proskuneo in spirit and truth." 6 times, in 5 sentences. Jesus is not using the word casually. He is doing something specific. He is taking proskuneo off the mountain. He is removing it from the temple. He is lifting it out of geography, out of ritual, out of location, and placing it somewhere that has no address. In spirit and truth. The Greek word for spirit here is pneuma, the interior self, the breath, the animating life of a person. The word for truth is aletheia, reality as opposed to shadow, substance as opposed to performance, the actual thing as opposed to a representation of it. Worship in spirit, not anchored to a place, not contingent on a setting, not triggered by an atmosphere. It comes from the interior life of a person who has genuinely oriented themselves toward God. Worship in truth, not performed for appearance, not maintained as religious habit, not constructed to feel like something. Real, substantive, the actual bowing of the actual self before the actual God. And then Jesus says something that should stop you completely. The Father is seeking such people. Not. The Father is waiting in the temple for such people. Not. The Father is pleased when such people show up on schedule. The Father is seeking them. The Greek is zideo, active, ongoing, pursuing. God is the one moving toward the worshiper. God is the one searching for a life that is genuinely oriented toward him in the interior, in reality, not just on the exterior and on schedule. This woman has not been inside a synagogue recently. She has not sung a hymn in the morning service. She has lived a life that has put her outside every category of religious respectability in her world. And Jesus tells her that the Father is searching for exactly what she is capable of giving. A heart that has run out of other options, that has exhausted every other source of meaning, that comes to the well at noon because it has no other place to go. That is proskuneo, not a song. A life that has nowhere left to bow except toward God. She leaves her water jar. The detail is so small that it is easy to miss. She has come to the well for water, practical, physical, necessary water. And she leaves without it. She runs back to the city she has been hiding from and says, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did." That is what proskuneo produces when it is real. You forget what you came for. You run toward the people you have been hiding from. You cannot stay where you were. Now we come back to the Roman soldier. His name is not given in the text. Matthew calls him a centurion, a commander of 100 men, a career military professional, someone who has climbed inside the Roman structure through discipline and performance and the willingness to do what was required. He is stationed in Capernaum. He has power. He has servants. He has a household that runs because he runs it. And one of his servants is dying. He has heard about Jesus. Something in what he has heard has done something to him that his military training never prepared him for. He sends elders of the Jews to Jesus, Jewish leaders speaking on behalf of a Roman officer, which is itself extraordinary. Then, As Jesus approaches, the centurion sends another message. Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. He is describing himself as unworthy. This man, this Roman centurion, trained in the culture that found proskunesis humiliating, trained in the empire that required proskuneo before Caesar, is describing himself as not worthy to have Jesus enter his house. And then he says something that makes Jesus stop walking and turn to the crowd. I also am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes. And to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. He has recognized something that the disciples are still working out. He has seen what Jesus holds. Not political authority, not military authority, but the authority that runs underneath all authority. The authority that gives orders to fevers, that speaks to storms, that commands the invisible structures of the created world. And here is where it gets remarkable. This man never meets Jesus face to face. The servant is healed at a distance. But what Matthew records is that when Jesus heard his words, he marveled. The Greek is ethomason, to be astonished. Jesus is astonished. And he says to the crowd, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. A Roman soldier, a man whose cultural background told him that proskuneo was for slaves, a man whose political world required him to proskuneo before the image of Caesar. This man and Apos' entire interior life has oriented itself toward Jesus with such clarity that Jesus himself calls it greater than anything he has found among his own people. That is proskuneo without the gesture. That is the interior reality that the gesture was always pointing toward. A life that has recognized who holds all authority and has made peace with the fact that it is not you. This is what John sees in the vision on Patmos. John is old when Revelation is written, old, exiled, on a volcanic island in the Aegean called Patmos. He has outlived almost everyone he loved. He has watched the church he helped build face persecution that would have broken most people. And on a Sunday, the Lord and Apos' day, he calls it, he hears a voice like a trumpet behind him. He turns. He sees 7 golden lampstands. And in the middle of the lampstands, someone like a son of man. Feet like burnished bronze, eyes like fire, a voice like many waters, a face like the sun in full strength. And John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, the one who leaned against Jesus at the Last Supper, the one who stood at the foot of the cross when everyone else had run, John falls at his feet as though dead. Proskuneo in Revelation is not an elevated feeling. It is a collapse. The body going down not from choice, but from recognition. This is too great. I cannot stand. There is nothing in me sufficient for this moment. The 24 elders in Revelation chapter 4 do something that should reframe everything you think about worship. They cast their crowns before the throne. Not. They hold their crowns up. Not. They display what they have achieved. They throw their crowns down. Every mark of their own authority, their own accomplishment, their own distinction, gone. Onto the floor before the throne. And they do not stop. The creatures around the throne do not stop, day and night, crying holy, holy, holy. The Greek implies continuous, unbroken, without ceasing. Not a weekly service. Not a scheduled hour. A posture that does not have an end time. That is the final image the New Testament gives us of proskuneo. Not a stage. A throne. Not a song. A collapse. Not a feeling. An orientation of the entire self, continuous, without reservation, before the one who holds all of it. So here is what proskuneo actually means. It means to fall down before the one who holds your life and acknowledge, with your whole being, that you are held. It means to transfer your allegiance, not just emotionally, not just mentally, but practically, in the choices you make when no one is watching and no song is playing. It means to live the way the centurion lived, the way the Samaritan woman lived after she left her water jar, the way the 24 elders live in Revelation, oriented, pointed, bowed. 3 things to carry with you. The first is this: worship was never a music style, and it was never confined to a building or a scheduled hour. The people in the Gospels who proskuneo before Jesus do it in boats, on roadsides, outside city walls, at midday wells. They do it in the middle of crisis and wonder and grief and desperation. The setting was always life. The scheduled service was meant to train you for the life, not to replace it. The second is this. The question Jesus asked the Samaritan woman at the well is the same question he is asking you. Not, which mountain do you worship on? Not, which tradition do you come from? Not, how long have you attended? The question is what your interior life is actually bowing toward. What has your allegiance? What are your choices, the ones made in private, the ones that cost you something? Reveal about where your proskuneo is actually pointed. And the third, this is the one to carry longest. The most worshipful moment in your week may not happen on Sunday. It may happen on a Tuesday morning when you are tired and the work is hard and no one will know whether you are honest or not. And you are honest anyway, because you belong to someone. It may happen in a conversation where you could protect your reputation or tell the truth. And you tell the truth, because your life is already surrendered to the one who sees all of it. It may happen when you love someone who has given you no reason to, when you forgive without an audience, when you serve without credit, when you choose the harder and truer thing because your life is pointed, bowed, toward God whether or not the lights are on and the band is playing. That is proskuneo. That is what the Father is seeking. That is what the Greek word was always pointing at. Not a voice lifted high, a life bowed low. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that makes the Christian gospel unlike any other framework in the ancient world, is that the God before whom you bow is not indifferent to you. He is not distant. He is not cold. He is not satisfied with the performance. He is the God who sought out a woman at a well at noon, who stopped walking for a Roman soldier, who pulled Peter out of the water, who touched a leper before he said a single word. He is the God who is seeking you. That is worth falling down for.